This is Horror Podcast.
Welcome to This is Horror, a podcast for readers, writers, and creators. I'm Michael David Wilson, and every episode I chat with masters of horror about writing, life lessons, creativity, and much more. Now, normally I'm joined by my co-host Bob Pastorella, but unfortunately, due to the recent hurricane in Texas, he is unable to join us for this conversation. Now, today's guest is Chuck Palahniuk, and I'm so excited to have him on the show. He is a dream guest for me, so I'm very thankful to be living that dream, to be living that reality. And I just got off the call with him. We had a fantastic conversation. We spoke about his new book, The Invention of Sound, which is the most horror novel he's ever written. You've got to go out and buy that. We talk about writing, we talk about life lessons, so a tremendous amount on its way with Chuck. So let's skip the preamble, have some words from our sponsors, and then we'll get to the main conversation.
Do you like The Twilight Zone? What about Tales from the Crypt? Or perhaps Black Mirror? Well, we got you covered. The Other Stories is a weekly short story podcast. We've got sci-fi, horror, thriller, and weird stories delivered right to your podcast feed every Monday morning. So find us on your favourite podcast app or go to acast.com/The Other Stories. And remember, these aren't the stories your mother used to tell you. These are the other stories.
From best-selling horror author Lee Mountford comes the Supernatural Horror Collection. 3 hugely popular novels in one box set. The Demonic, The Mark, and Forest of the Damned, together in one terrifying volume. Available in ebook and paperback, and a high-quality audiobook that is sure to get under your skin. Haunted houses, haunted forests, haunted people. Search Amazon and Audible now for the Supernatural Horror Collection. Don't just read horror, experience it.
All right, well, with that said, here it is. It is a conversation with Chuck Palahniuk on This is Horror. Chuck, welcome to This is Horror.
Thank you, Michael. I am glad to be here. You are spoken very highly of.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, I hope that I do not disappoint. But thank you to the people out there who are speaking kindly about me. Now, let's begin where I always like to begin, and that is with early life lessons. So I'm wondering, what lessons did you learn when you were growing up in a mobile home in Burbank, Washington?
I was so lucky. I grew up kind of during a really golden age of horror, and that included EC Comics, and that included nighttime anthology shows like The Night Gallery, and The Night Stalker, which was a fantastic show. And we could not stay up for Night Gallery because it was on a school night. So it was on Wednesday night, and every Thursday morning, my siblings and I would force my mother to tell us the plot of every segment of The Night Gallery on the night before. And my mother would have to remember every plot point so that she could tell moment by moment what happened in each of the 2, 3, sometimes 4 segments of The Night Gallery with Rod Sterling the night before. And that's how I learned how to plot stories.
And that is amazing. And I mean, did your mum have to take notes for that, or did she just have a very good memory?
I think she was just very bright, and she knew that there was an expectation that we would want to know what led to what and what caused what, and what the ultimate payoff would be. So she had to remember every detail so that it would make sense in the telling.
So this was your first experience with hearing story, but I'm wondering, at what point were you then allowed to watch Night Gallery?
I didn't get to see Night Gallery until as an adult. I see it now on MeTV on cable service. It's a lot less scary now.
Yeah, and I imagine as well, I mean, just having the power of your imagination, I mean, it would have a lot that it would have to live up to, when you've been told the story, to then see it visually. I mean, unfortunately, it can be easy to disappoint, especially when you're a child. I mean, I know a number of people that we've spoken to, they'd look through these books where they had images from old Hammer horror films and things like that, and they tell themselves the story, and often what they conjured up would be more impressive and darker than what was on the screen.
And another element of that is that I remember Darren McGavin in The Night Stalker, which was a kind of the source material, the inspiration for the X-Files. Chris Carter even patterns the opening sequence of the X-Files after the opening sequence of The Night Stalker. And I remember The Night Stalker, every episode being terrifying. But when I see it in DVD and I can binge watch it episode after episode, I see that they shot that series on a shoestring budget, because you see the same painting showing up in office after office, and you see the same establishing shot of hospitals with palm trees, and McGavin obviously driving through the streets of Los Angeles. So you really see it fall apart in terms of production quality, but that's only because you can watch back-to-back episodes.
Yeah, do you think the way in which we're consuming media now with the likes of on-demand television, do you think that is having a kind of effect in the way in which we process story?
That's a good point. It makes it much more difficult to do anthology television, because you have to come up with such an entirely different set of characters and circumstances for each episode, and that cost is really destroyed anthology. Even HBO's series about the hotel room, in which you had basically the same standing set, but a different cast and a different story each week, even that had a really high production cost. So I think anthology television, is just not conducive for current streaming.
Yeah, and on that note, am I right in thinking that you're working on a TV series for Apple at the moment?
I was. Apple gave us a development deal and funded our first round of scripts. And they ultimately seemed to really love what we produced, which was incredibly dark. But they said by the time they needed it, they needed something much more general. And they were really frightened away from something so dark and so completely challenging. There was one great production meeting. It wasn't with Apple. It was with another big network or streaming service. And I pitched them one particular episode, which is about what is known as bug chasing and gift giving, which is basically, it would be an episode about a character who charges people money in order to infect them with HIV. And the whole thing is done with euphemisms, the euphemism donut glazing. And so at one point, the legal counsel for this huge network in this skyscraper overlooking Los Angeles, she sort of stops me and she says, "Am I getting this right? Are you really pitching us an episode about butt fucking?" And I said, "No, I'm pitching you an episode about donut glazing, which is unprotected butt fucking." And I think that's pretty much where the pitch ended. So that's pretty much, what the kind of edgy, dark, challenging stuff that I think you can only do in horror right now, because everything else has got to play the politically correct game. But horror can find euphemisms and can find ways around all of those obstacles.
Yeah, and I feel that you getting, pushback from Apple, it seems a theme that has occurred a lot in your creative life. I mean, this is similar to what happened with Invisible Monsters. You had a number of publishers that really enjoyed it. They saw the potential, but they said, we do not want to be attached to that. We do not want to publish it. And so then you wrote Fight Club and got your start that way.
And marketing seems to be a big obstacle, especially in publishing. The acquisitions board, they have to take it to a board that represents everyone in the publishing house. And it was always the marketing department that would say, we have no idea what shelf to put this on in the bookstore. And so unless we can define it by existing books, we just don't know how to sell it. And that was a problem all the way through the marketing of the Fight Club movie, is that David Fincher tells this hilarious story about the head of marketing for 20th Century Fox sitting through a screening of the movie and then grabbing David, more or less by the collar and saying, congratulations, you have made my job a misery. You have created a movie with so much male nudity in it that no man is ever going to pay to see it, and so much blood in it that no woman is ever going to pay to see it. You have created the ultimate impossible to sell movie. Thanks a lot. And so my stuff always has to kind of sell itself because it can't be sold in relation to other successes.
Right. And I mean, if I think of all the books and stories that you've written, I mean, none of them really fit in a neat genre box, nor do I think you would want them to. I mean, they're all straddling different genres. And I mean, sometimes people kind of term fiction in that ballpark transgressive, but I think even that label is so malleable that, I mean, does it even count as a genre label?
It used to. You could talk about transgressive fiction, and you could talk about the Monkey Wrench Gang, and you could talk about political protest fiction, which might or might not include Train Spotting or American Psycho or Fight Club. But really, since 9/11, transgressive fiction has sort of lumped in with terrorism. So it's kind of a dead sort of school of fiction.
Yeah, which is why, I mean, you've been saying that you've turned more towards the horror genre. Although, I mean, it certainly sounds from talking about your early experiences with story that horror has always been a concern. It's always been a mode that you've been interested in. I mean, reading your early stories, it's clear that things are pretty goddamn dark. I mean, look at Guts, for example.
And Guts was up for, I believe, a Bram Stoker Award. It was up for some just wonderful horror awards. But I always fall back on, the past of Ray Bradbury and Matheson and even Earl Hamner. Hamner is the guy who fictionalized himself as John Boy Walton and created the Waltons. But before that, he had written for Outer Limits, and he'd written for Twilight Zone, and he'd written some of the darkest, most twisted stuff that was on television. And this is what John Boy Walton grew up to write. And then ultimately in the 80s, he wrote and created Falcon Crest, which was one of the big primetime soap operas. So I am just charmed by these people who can write the really dark, edgy, short stuff, but then they can go out and they can sell, mainstream Jane Wyman Falcon Crest.
Yeah. And I wanted to take things all the way back to your early age, because I think that this kind of might help paint a picture for people in terms of your origin story, because I know that you've always had this simultaneous fear and attraction to conflict. So I'm wondering, where do you think that stemmed from?
Oh, years ago, I sat down and I did an hours-long interview with Andrew Sullivan. And he more or less fessed up that he always has to put himself in opposition with whatever group he's working with, whatever newsroom, whatever magazine staff, because his parents fought like dogs. His father was more or less kind of a football hooligan. His mom really went head to head with him. And he grew up in a household where his parents fought like animals. And so he's only comfortable around people who are fighting. And if they're not fighting, he has to get them fighting. So he's always putting himself against whoever he's with. And I recognized that I get a nostalgic kind of thrill when I'm around people who are fighting. There's something very comforting about that because my parents fought a great deal. And so Fight Club was really a way to kind of put a toe in the water and to explore conflict in a very completely consensual, structured way between friends. And I think that this is kind of a purpose it serves for a lot of people who read it and who watch the movie, is that it gives them a way to be with conflict that doesn't completely exclude them or shut them down.
Yeah, and I think the popularity of Fight Club and the popularity of mixed martial arts like UFC shows that there is a demand for that consensual fighting.
And it's a physical, visceral kind of entertainment that involves you on not just an intellectual level, that it pulls your whole body into what you're watching.
Yeah.
And horror does that also. Horror pulls your entire body in as well as your mind and your emotions.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, speaking of horror, your forthcoming novel, The Invention of Sound, I mean, it might be the most horror novel you've ever written.
I think it definitely is. I think I've gotten some short stories out there that kind of go over the top in terms of horror. But The Invention of Sound really is what I refer to as tableau horror. That think about the movie Seven. We never actually see any of the people killed. We always arrive after the fact, and we see a kind of static tableau that suggests the enormous cruelty and violence that took place. And then we examine that tableau in very detached forensic procedural language. And so whether it's Seven or Da Vinci Code, or it is The Alienist, we're never seeing the violence performed. We're always seeing the after effects of the violence. And I find that really fascinating because so much of horror is about not just showing the after effects, it's about showing the actual violence take place. And that's something I wanted to save in Invention of Sound until really the end. I just didn't want to go there until I had to.
Yeah, and given the subject matter, I'm imagining maybe on your computer you have a VPN or you're on the dark web a lot, because I mean some of the things that you must have to look up in the research of this novel, I mean you don't want people to be aware that that's the kind of thing you're Googling.
You know, I don't think I've ever been on the dark web. I'm not even sure how I would find it, but my primary research source is always other people. Because I figure by the time it's on the web or by the time it's on television, God forbid, it is so processed and it is so commonly known. And I really want the stuff that people only tell to other people, and they only tell it in private, and they only tell it typically after they've had a drink or two. So I want the really the rawest stuff I can find, and you only get that from people.
Yeah, and then that goes back to your writing method, because I know that you are often writing in public. I mean, in normal circumstances, obviously at the moment with the pandemic, that's been changed a little bit, but going to gyms and cafes and places where you can actually interact with other people. And you're also doing that in a notebook. You're doing that physically. It's not typing. I think you said before that, you know, that the writing, that's the physical act, whereas when you're on the computer, that's just the editing. That's more a what's the word? It's just more a a robotic thing. It's not really a creative process.
Right. It's like bookkeeping.
Yeah.
You know, the real writing is when someone phrases something in this extraordinary way, makes an observation that I had never completely reinvents a topic for me. And that's the stuff I want to capture in the moment in a notebook. And then I start to compile it in a kind of bookkeeping session when I'm actually keyboarding it. I just like sitting at a computer so much. And the more I can sit around and eavesdrop on people, the fresher the stuff will always be. And well, the added bonus is also that if I want to create work that people can read in crowded airports and on crowded airplanes and in all these distracting, horrible circumstances in hospitals, then I need to create it in those circumstances. If it can't hold my attention in those noisy, bothersome, subway cars, then it's not going to hold anybody else's attention in those circumstances.
I think that's a really good point and a really compelling reason for people to get out there and to create in these noisy environments. And I mean, we are living in this attention economy, and there are so many things that we're competing with as writers. You've got video games, you've got Netflix, you've got movies, you've got graphic novels, which of course you've branched into with Fight Club 2 and Fight Club 3. And to hold the attention of someone for a novel length work, it's a difficult task.
One of my favorite places to work is hospital emergency room waiting areas, because people typically aren't allowed to watch television, so you don't have a kind of a dominant form of media there. But everyone's under stress, and so there's always comfortable chairs. So you get to be around all these people who are under stress. They're talking to each other, so you're hearing language. But they're just terrific places to work.
So when you're writing in an emergency room, I mean, are you having to do a kind of tour of local emergency rooms so you're not always in the same one? Or is there a particular ER where the staff are aware, like, oh, that's just Chuck, he kind of comes here and does his thing, just don't worry about him?
I do kind of change it up between Good Samaritan and Emmanuel Hospital, but I pretty much stick to one or the other. There and airports, those are my favorite places.
And have you got to know many of the staff there?
No, because my purpose in being there is just to be that fly on the wall.
Yeah.
And to test my material by working on it with distraction, but also to be able to look up at any moment. If I need a gesture or a physical detail, I can look up at 200 or 300 people, and someone will be doing the thing or displaying the behavior that I need. And I can just kind of harvest it in that moment.
Yeah, and this is such a good creative writing exercise, particularly for people that are more used to just staying at home or in front of the computer, or perhaps they have quite an empty, quiet cafe that they go to. Get out in the world, get into one of these busy environments, and right there, see how it changes your flow and your work, and just experiment with it.
One thing that happened while I was still teaching in a workshop where we were meeting in person, it was 15 to 20 people, is that someone mentioned, we were talking about a used magazine store that was closing down. And at one point, I had been in a used magazine store, a huge place called Periodicals Paradise, possibly the largest used magazine store in the world. And I was doing all this research in old magazines. And throughout the entire time I was there, every 15 or 20 minutes, a guy would bring in cases and cases of Playboy magazines. And the owner of the store would explain that they did not buy Playboys or National Geographics because people never threw them away. And so there were so many of them in the world that they had no value. And so each of these guys was forced to haul away these enormous collections of Playboys that until that moment, they thought each guy would think that what he had a huge value. But then he would suddenly find out it was just a burden. And someone in the writer's workshop, a student, said, I wonder if that's how the box of porn in the woods happens. And suddenly, everybody leaned forward. And people ranging in age from 65 to 18 years old, everyone in that group had a story about finding the box of porn in the woods. And we all realized it was an archetypal experience that we had all had, but none of us had ever shared it. And it's in moments like that that you recognize that a commonly held, undiscussed story has such fantastic power as an archetype that you can do anything with it. And for a long time, we had thrown around the idea that we would each write a short story and we would put them together and publish them as a collection. And then one student, Patricia, suggested the perfect title. We were going to call it Children of the Porn. And
yes.
It was such a fantastically sticky idea. People could not put it down. But it is really hard to get a publisher to sign on to do a book that has the word children and porn in the title.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, my God, you put that on something like Amazon and probably the algorithms are going to ban it straight away.
See? It bans itself.
Yeah. But you're right. It's the perfect title. Oh.
And while we're there, one of those students is a man named Tyler Jones, who speaks very, very highly of you. And Tyler has a new book out called Criterium. And so Criterium by Tyler Jones, I just wanted to give it a shout out while I'm on here. Criterium by Tyler Jones. It is a novella. Give it a chance. It has a fantastic cover by David Mack, the comic artist who's done all of the Fight Club 2 and Fight Club 3 graphic novel covers.
Yeah, and I've actually just started reading Criterium, and it is so tight. I mean, in terms of the prose, and it really does have that great minimalist style that I think people who are fans of your writing are really going to enjoy. So, I mean, I'm looking forward to getting back to that and completing it, because, I mean, from the beginning, I'm into it. The only reason I haven't actually consumed all of it in one setting is because I was reading and rereading so much of your stuff to prepare for this interview. But I can certainly endorse that as well. And I'm very appreciative of Tyler for saying wonderful things about me too. So thank you, Tyler.
Tyler also put me in touch with Cemetery Dance. And they picked up a brand new short story of mine, and that's published in their latest issue. So my thanks to Cemetery Dance as well. I just want to sort of get it all out of the way.
Yeah. And so is that issue out now, or if not, do you know when it will be coming out?
It was supposed to be out in June, and so I really thought that they were bringing it out late, but I thought they were bringing it out in August or September.
Right, yeah. I mean, as you are well aware of, so many publishing schedules, I guess, particularly for the independent presses as well, with everything happening with COVID, it's a bit of a nightmare at the moment, and the usual rules of operating are out the window.
Yeah, the book tours are really scrubbed. So many book tours, so many movies not going on screens.
Yeah, well, that was something I wanted to talk to you about as well, because, I mean, I think you're pretty well known for having these elaborate and interesting in-person events where you do things like give out, autographed limbs because too many people were getting tattoos of your autograph, so you decided to solve that problem for them. But of course, now you're having to do a virtual book tour for the Invention of Sound. So, I mean, I'm wondering what kind of things are you having to do to make these events as unique and memorable as the in-person events?
I'm kind of stuck. I have no idea. I've never done a virtual event. And so I was just kind of going to go with it. I'm already planning for next year. I'm figuring next year we'll get together. I'll have 2 paperbacks next year, and I'll be able to do a big dog and pony show again. I already got huge shipments of flashing light up stuff already ordered for next year.
Nice.
So next year will be the big back to work year.
Yeah. So are those 2 new books that you have coming out next year?
It'll be the paperbacks for this year's writing book, which was Consider This, and it'll be the paperback for this year's novel, which is The Invention of Sound.
Yeah, and I mean, those are the 2 books that are so perfect for listeners of This Is Horror, because, I mean, we're a horror podcast, so that's The Invention of Sound, but we also like to get into the craft of writing, so that's Consider This. So, I mean, there really wasn't a better time to get you on the show, and those are the books for our listeners.
And boy, it is so much nicer to learn writing from that book than it is from me, because I am the John Houseman, I am the paper chase professor of writing, and I will not hesitate to make you cry. So I just burn through the students.
Yeah, I think that one of my creative writing professors probably took a cue from you when I was at the University of Warwick, because he decided as an experiment to get us all to do this big assignment, and then he'd read each story aloud, and at the moment that he would have put the story down, he'd just rip it up. And the look on those students' faces and the reaction, there were some people that did not take too kindly to that.
I had one of those classes in college, and the professor would read our work out loud as if he were the writer, and he would always make fun of it as he was reading it. And so, before I dropped out of his class, I wrote a story which began with the line, "The dog's penis tasted salty," and then it went downhill from there. And this poor guy had to debase himself reading that entire story. And once I had my revenge, I dropped his class and never looked back.
Yeah. So you purposely wrote that for him, knowing he was going to read it out loud. You're like, okay, well, if that's the game that you're playing, I'm going to one-up you.
Exactly. I wrote it to humiliate and degrade that pompous jerk.
Yeah. I mean, what?
I love humiliation and degradation. I'm the one that has to stand up there and read guts to people. But, there's a difference between humiliating yourself and humiliating other people. And I'm all for the former, but I will not stand for the latter.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of that kind of thing, there's something, I can't remember if you said it in Consider This or if you've said it live, probably both. But I mean, with writing, you said you're not writing to be liked, you're writing to be remembered.
Exactly. And the more they like you up front, the faster they will forget you. Those books that hit huge and they hit big and they're gone in a year. You go out and find me a copy of the Celestine Prophecy. People don't even know what that is. These books that were the best book ever are forgotten so quickly.
Yeah. And I think, it's not a bad lesson to kind of have for life, live to be remembered. I mean, obviously there are going to be some caveats. There are some people that we remember for very fucking terrible reasons. So, don't actually go out killing people or anything like that. But I do think perhaps because of this social media instant gratification world that we live in, there are perhaps too many people who are obsessed in terms of their likability and how others perceive them, rather than being more concerned about creating good art or living an authentic life.
And there's an old trope about if you design a house to please one person, it will ultimately please everyone. But if you try to design a house that will please everyone, it will please absolutely no one.
Yeah.
So there is that, the message is to stay really true to your own vision, and not to try to manage anything by committee in that way.
Yeah. Is that ever anything that you've struggled with, or have you ever had times where, you've faltered or you've questioned whether you're going down the right path?
In the very first, when I was first writing, and I had my first novel going around to agents, this would have been in 1990. I was talking to an agent, somebody in Seattle of all places, and she was hemming and hawing, and I was trying to get her to tell me yes or no, what she didn't like about the book, see if we could work. And she was saying that there were parts of the book that she found really disturbing and she really did not care for. And I was saying, well, I could change those parts. I could make those parts into anything that you would like on the page. And then she finally crumbled and she said, no, she found the entire book disturbing and distasteful. And I said, well, I can change the entire book. I can change everything about the book.
Okay.
And I heard myself say that. And I realized, oh my gosh, if I'm going to be that way, I'm going to really hate writing. It's always going to be about making somebody else happy. And I thought, no, I've got to draw the line. And I thanked her for reading the material, and I called it a loss, but I swore that I was never going to buckle under like that ever again. In fact, now when people say, okay, we think it goes a little too far, my reaction is to go even farther.
Yeah.
And the great example was that the line in Fight Club. I thought the Fight Club had to have one line that went too far. And that is the moment when Marla makes love with Tyler.
Yes.
And rather than say, I want to have your baby, she says, I really want to have your abortion.
Yeah.
And everyone at 20th Century Fox hated that line. And even Brad Pitt came to me and said, my mother is going to see this movie. Could we change that to anything else? And so they finally dumped it in David Fincher's lap. And David Fincher changed that line to, I haven't been fucked like that since grade school.
Yeah.
And everyone at Fox went nuts and said, could we change it, please, back to the abortion line? And Fincher said no. Oh, and happy birthday to David Fincher. His birthday was late last week. So David Fincher, happy late birthday.
All right. Happy birthday to David. And yeah, like, I've heard that story before, and I mean, it still is enjoyable every time you tell it. And of those two lines, I mean, how do you even pick which one is worse? But I mean, that's what happens if you ask to change a line. It's like, well, maybe we'll change it, but I don't know if you're going to like what we're going with here.
And so often, and I would urge writers that if something doesn't work, it's not because it goes too far. It's because it needs to be dialed up even farther.
Mm.
So there is an authority in doing the thing that is completely above and beyond wrong. And so if an effect, if a moment, if a line is not quite working, maybe it needs to be more extreme instead of less extreme.
Yeah. Are there any examples of that in the latest one, The Invention of Sound, where you originally had a tamer version and then dialed it up?
Oh, I don't want to give away too much. Oh my gosh, the scene on the mountain that's told in retrospect.
That is one of the parts that really messed me up.
Vicious. And that is from true life.
Oh, no.
It originally had been a peanut allergy story, and my first readers had said, you can't go with a peanut allergy story. It's too mainstream. It's been done too often. And I knew it needed to be dialed up. It needed to go up to something that people had not seen before.
Yeah.
And I was in Los Angeles, and I was working with the showrunner, John Scheiben. And John and I were putting together this anthology series that we sold to Apple. And John was telling me about an actor friend of his that he had worked with on The X-Files, because John had been showrunner on The X-Files and Breaking Bad. And he just came off of Ozarks. John put together Ozarks. Anyway, John was telling me that this actor was riding his motorcycle down the freeway in Los Angeles, and he caught a bee in the face, and the bee stung him. And he hadn't been allergic up until that moment. And suddenly he started to have this enormous anaphylactic shock reaction. And as he was blacking out and he was thinking, I'm going to die, and he managed to pull his motorcycle over to the shoulder, as he collapsed and the motorcycle fell on top of him, the tailpipe burned his leg to the bone. And it burned him so badly that the doctor later told him that fantastic, painful burn acted like a shot of, what is it they give people? Adrenaline.
Yeah.
It triggered a huge adrenaline response, and it saved his life like an EpiPen would have. And so I'll just say that true story about how the actor didn't die, I ended up taking that to the Invention of Sound and making the standard peanut allergy story into something monstrous and horrible and even legendary, because it ties into so many different fairy tales. But it took something very banal and took it to a level nobody had seen before. And I can hear it from you that even you were freaked out by that.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the most vicious parts of the novel. That was a part where it's like, okay, after I ended that chapter, it felt like I'd physically been through something. I had to get up and take a bit of a breather.
And the fact that it's happening between two children makes it even more...
Yeah. Well, so much of this novel, I mean, it is concerned on a surface level with the protagonist, Gates Foster, looking for his missing daughter. I think because I have a 2-year-old daughter, and since becoming a father, I've become more sensitive to these things. It just ratcheted up everything about the Invention of Sound, having that personal experience. And it was an uncomfortable read, but you know, I enjoyed it in the way that all of us horror readers do. You know, it's an experience like a roller coaster. It's a adrenaline rush. We enjoy being scared and getting a little bit fucked up. But man, you really knocked it out of the park, to use a terrible cliche there.
Well, notice that in stories that are primarily aimed at young people, and I'm thinking Disney movies and situation comedies on television, it's almost always a dead parent. And it's not just Disney with its legendary dead mothers. It is every major sitcom through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, either one or both, either the mother or the father, is dead before the story starts. And so comedy sort of starts with this off-screen tragedy that no one is ever addressing. No one ever talks about which parent died in the Brady Bunch. The Partridge Family never talk about their dead father. Nanny and the Professor, Nanny never talks about Courtship of Eddie's father. Eddie talks about everything except for his dead mother. There are so many dead mothers and fathers throughout television history, and no one ever talks about them. Family Affair, Buffy and Jody, they never talk about their dead parents. But that is a way to get right to the heart of children, is to show a child who's lost a parent. And a way to get to the heart of adults is to show a parent who's lost a child. And that takes you right to the heart of your adult audience, because that is their worst fear. And they will automatically admire and feel for an adult character who's lost a child. It always works. It worked in my book Lullaby.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm drawn to the father who's lost a child because I never had children. And I now am at a point in my life where I am mourning the kids I never had. And so it allows me to kind of express that grief.
And I mean, what does that look like for you, mourning the kids you never had? At what point did you realize you were mourning, and how does that manifest?
It brings me back to writing that character, a man who's lost a child. I don't think I can do it too often. There are authors like Jodi Picoult who kind of made an empire out of writing about dead children. And I just don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that writer. But there's different ways of always going to that dead child or that dead parent archetype. My story Zombies, that was in Playboy, and I love that story because it would make even the most hardened hipsters cry in public. I could look out over an audience of college students and see these 25-year-old guys weeping, see the tears on their cheeks, because it's about a kid who's lost both his parents and is not stopped by it. And he's able to say some really unvarnished observations about what it's like to not have his parents. And that is a young person's worst fear, is losing his or her parents. And finding a new way to demonstrate that will automatically take you right to the heart of your audience.
Yeah, I think a lot is looking for these universal fears or these universal experiences, such as the Playboy magazines in the woods, and then seeing how can I really tap into that and how can I mold it into something unique and original.
And people automatically have sort of a stake in the story because they thought that they were the only one.
Yeah.
And now they're seeing, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one.
Yeah. Well, something else that the invention of sound is about is commodification, and the way in which our personal lives are commodified, and in this particular instance, in the invention of sound, the commodification of death. So I wonder, when did commodification become a concern and something you were acutely aware of?
I don't think I was really aware of the commodification of human experience until I had to go out and promote the book Fight Club. Because until then, I thought people went on to talk shows because somehow they knew the host of the talk show and they were friends. And you went on and you talked to Oprah Winfrey for an hour because you two were best buds.
Right.
And then after being in one green room after another and seeing all of these washed up VJs and these washed up actors and these washed up singers all traveling the country, appearing on daytime television in these really small markets, trying to sell whatever their latest thing was, whether it's a book or a recording or some invention. It was just so heartbreaking because I could just see them. Basically, they are Willie, the death of a salesman guy. And it's the new thing. It's the death of it's a dead celebrity out shilling a thing. And I really saw how, human experience is so commodified. It just broke my heart. Willie Loman, death of a salesman.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, because being a celebrity is so fleeting, it's something I think about quite a bit. And you have these pop bands and acts like Steps and S Club 7 that were really big in the 90s, and they were really big for a number of years. But then now, I mean, what are they doing I don't know. I doubt many people know. And, how does it feel for them? What happens when you reach the height of fame and the height of celebrity, but then 5 years down the road, you're nobody? How do you deal with that? It's going to be a strange thing to have that effect on you.
And I've seen a certain amount of cruelty where whatever the program was, the host kind of got a revenge on whoever had been the teen idol
Right.
of a few years before, and really put them through the ringer and humiliated them. And so watching people sort of constantly sell themselves in order to make a living and try to get back into the spotlight is really painful to watch. And it's not a big jump from there to the idea of killing people and commodifying the moment of their death. I'm amazed at the really private aspects of our lives that are bought and sold right now. Google knows exactly what niche of pornography I'm always looking for.
Yeah.
Google knows and sells things about me that used to be my deepest, darkest secrets, but now they're part of an algorithm and they're being used to market other pop-up ads to me. And, everybody knows somewhere. So I'm just amazed that the things that used to be almost sacred in a profane way are now sort of legal tender.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you look up one thing and then suddenly you've got about 20 ads for similar things. And if you keep clicking on them, well, even more are going to appear. It's very smart and simultaneously terrifying.
Yeah. So, and there's no getting away from it.
Mm.
When I started writing the book, Beautiful You, which is about these kind of evil sex toys to take over the world.
Yeah.
And that was when the Trojan Twister was being advertised very heavily on primetime television. And I never thought I would live to see the day when really fancy vibrators were being advertised with really pretty girls on television. And they would all be giving each other vibrators at parties.
Yeah.
And it would be handled sort of euphemistically, but I just never thought I would live to see that. So I had to write a book about it.
Yeah. I don't know if Ann Summers is popular in America, but you do have these like kind of sex toy parties in the UK that, I mean, are almost like can be marketed from anywhere, from kind of late teenagers to whatever age. And they're Ann Summers parties, but Ann Summers is a very mainstream kind of sex toy and lingerie store that's about in the UK. And then they decided we'll have have an Ann Summers rep come around, and then you pass all these vibrators and toys and beads and all sorts around, and then if you buy any on the night you get a discount.
And you know that there's got to be a lot of wine consumed on those
nights.
Oh
yeah, you know.
Oh, yeah. And you're buying stuff that you cannot return because of the intimate nature of it.
Yeah.
And you're basically just kind of hosting a party where everyone's going to get loaded and buy things that they kind of regret buying.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, on the nature of commodifying death, it made me think of, there was this social media site that I saw a few weeks ago. I can't remember what it's called, but if you sign up, you can then tell them the social media profiles that you currently have, and then they'll create a kind of forever account so that when you die, it uses AI to take all of the things that you used to tweet or talk about, and then it will continue to write these statuses for you. And I thought this must be some sort of piss take or Black Mirror thing, but it genuinely looks like it's real, and they're trying to market it as, your loved ones will have a piece of you. You're going to be effectively living forever. It will bring them joy. And it's like, no, this is this is fucked up. And if you take it to its inevitable conclusion, I mean, you look at maybe even just 100 years, then at that point, you're probably going to have more dead people on social media than you are actual living people.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
In that same vein, one of the really early sort of things that put me off, but also clued me into this commodification, is that one of the first splurges I did with Fight Club money is that nobody in my family had ever had a tombstone. We're just not a family that has enough money for grave markers. Just a lower working class family. But when my grandparents died, I had enough money to buy them a tombstone. And I went to the mortuary, and they sat me down with these catalogs. And one of the sort of avenues to explore was they started asking me what products my grandparents bought and enjoyed. And they started showing me tombstones in cemeteries for teenage girls. And some had Coke and Pepsi logos on them, and some had Voight volleyballs on them because the teenage girl really loved volleyball. And they had all these different marketing agreements with major manufacturers that they could put the trademarks and the brand names of products on the tombstones of people who use those products. So as you walk through cemeteries, you would see all this badging, all these logos, all these memes from companies on all these otherwise beautiful tombstones. And that seemed like a kind of horror I had never seen before. And when I said that my grandfather had been a farmer, they said, was he a John Deere guy or an International Harvester guy? And then they showed me tombstones with either a John Deere tractor on it or an International Harvester tractor on it. They said, choose one or the other. And it just sounded like the ultimate commodification of putting an advertisement on a dead person's tombstone above their name. And it was bigger than their name. And it was instead of an epitaph. That was disgusting.
Yeah. I was not familiar with that, and yet I'm not surprised. It almost seems inevitable. I think it's difficult to be surprised by these things and the lengths that corporations will go. I mean, if it's going to make them money, then they're gonna do it. And I mean, we see that play out again and again.
And also the heartbreak that when people come in, they know so little about their loved one.
Yeah.
They don't know a poem that the loved one loved. They don't have something eloquent that they would like to see on that tombstone. All that they know is that their loved one liked Pepsi instead of Coke. That is the only thing they know is the consumer preferences of the people closest to them. And that's what I find the most heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I was a reporter all through college, and occasionally I'd get stuck writing obituaries. And so when the editor wanted a longer obituary, I would have to call the next of kin, and I would sort of politely talk to them about what the deceased was like as a person, and try to evoke a memory, some sort of anecdote that I could put in the obituary. And I was always stunned by how little the loved ones could bring to mind about the person who had just died. That people seem to really be so unaware of each other. And I think when events like Christmas, gift-giving events come around, people have no idea who each other are. So they just buy the thing that's most effectively advertised. And that's what you give at Christmas, because you don't know anything about the other person. And so I think that's another form of commodifying people, is turning them into the product that you're told they want.
Right. And so many festivals and things like Valentine's Day, I mean, they came about by organizations such as Hallmark. It was an excuse to sell more things. But I mean, when it comes to Christmas and birthday, if I can't think of something that is personal and special and specific to that person, I'd rather just not get them anything, because otherwise I'm just getting them meaningless shit. It's like it feels like an empty gesture to me. So, get to know the friends and the family that mean something to you. But if not, it's a bit of a facade.
Yeah, and then the other horrible part is they are getting you meaningless shit.
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
Yeah, and we're paying money for it.
Well, yeah, like sometimes as a kid, some of the distant relatives will get me things and they just kind of highlight to me how little they knew about me. Particularly as like a teenage goth and metalhead, and it's like, you've got me a fucking Adidas sweater? That is the opposite to what I'm into. What are you doing?
Yes. And that's the difference between buying you the thing that they like and the thing that you like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trying to think of a way to get this back around to horror. So if you can help out.
Well, I mean, it is a little bit horrifying having an Adidas sweater as a teenage goth. And what is also horrifying are some Hollywood sound effects, such as in the Invention of Sound. I mean, you were talking about the smack of somebody's skull splitting open on a stone floor is effectively a head of lettuce that's frozen and dropped, landing next to a mic. And I love how this is also about these sound effects and how they're created. And it wasn't anything I'd really thought about until reading this book, but I mean, you better believe that I went investigating after, and I couldn't believe the amount of movies that use the Wilhelm scream. I mean, it's like everywhere. It's in Star Wars, it's in Indiana Jones.
The Wilhelm scream and the yodel, the goofy.
Yes.
Goofy yodel?
Yeah, that's the one.
And the Howie Long scream, the Howie scream. These things are just landmarks, and they're used in video games. They're used everywhere.
Yeah. And they have these brilliant names as well, which you utilize in the book. I mean, they're so on the nose. The original name of the Wilhelm scream being "The man was bit by alligator screamed and then he died."
Yeah, it's such an elegant title, like a painting or a piece of conceptual art.
Yeah.
Just kind of a tangent that is, I always regret saying this, is that when David Fincher submitted Fight Club to the ratings board, it was going to get an NC-17 rating if it didn't get an X rating. And so one thing he did to get it an R rating was he took out a layer of sound effects that was basically the impact, the really violent sort of noise that sold every slug or every violent injury, the really gore level of sound effect. He took out that layer, ran it for the ratings board, got the R rating he wanted, and then he put that layer back in.
Yeah.
So that's how important sound can be. When you're watching Alien and they bust the mask off of John Hurt's face, I swear, when we hear that the first time, we think that is his skull that is breaking in half. It's such a sharp, cracking sound. And it's the perfect moment. And just that sound is so horrifying. Stir of echoes. Every time that fingernail breaks in the flashback, in the little sort of psychic blip scenes, we hear that fingernail break. And whether or not our eyes are open or closed, we hear that fingernail break. It's those sounds that really, really get us below the radar.
Yeah. Well, I know that we're coming up to the time that we have together, and we've got a number of Patreon questions, so I wanted to take a few of those. So the first one is from Max Booth, and he says, "Is it true at one point 2 sequels were planned for Rant forming a trilogy. If so, is that still a project you're interested in pursuing, and what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, there were 2 sequels planned. And the gruesome magic about publishing is that if the initial book does not sell enough, you will never get a contract to write the sequels. And so, it might be that I pick it up with a podcast. I'm working on scripted podcasts. It might be that I can spin it into a scripted series. But, publishers are not going to pay unless they see the money from the original book reach a certain level. So sequels are just not bankable right now. Sorry.
Right, yeah. And I mean, a trilogy that you did have success with was the Damned and Doomed trilogy. Was that something that came about because of the initial sales for the first book, or was that a case of selling it all in one go?
Well, see, me pushing it. I don't think Random House really wanted 3 books, and I kind of forced them to put Doomed out. But there was another book. There was a 3rd book called Delivered that they would not buy. So that was another case where the trilogy didn't come into the world because there were not enough sales of the first 2 books. So I'll leave it at that. But again, if the first 2 books don't sell, they will not buy the 3rd book.
Yeah.
There's just, there's realities, and you're just not stopped by them. Yeah, you always work on another project. You move forward. You got to be a grown-up about it.
Yeah. And I mean, also, you don't know when a book might take off. I mean, we have seen instances of years, even decades later, for whatever reason, maybe a book is picked up and there's a film adapted, and then suddenly that book gets a second life. Well, at that point, sequels and potential trilogies are back on the table.
Philip K. Dick really owned the 80s. Almost every big movie coming out in the 80s about science fiction or fantasy was a Philip K. Dick book. So, it would be nice if it happened in my lifetime, but that's not necessary.
Right. Well, Zac Dozier says, you've always been incredibly generous with your time with both your readers and with writers just starting their careers. What can we do to pay it forward?
Wow. You can pay it forward by just reading more books. And this is another thing I'd kind of ask. This is a big ask, but there's a lot of piracy out there. Recently, I was asked to do a bunch of writing for a subscription service, and I saw that they had a huge amount of my work that had been uploaded as PDFs by subscribers. And these were all basically pirated things. And they included a lot of short stories that must have somehow been snuck out of my publisher because they were not edited. They were the first drafts of stories that never should have seen the light of day. But somehow people had PDFs of them. And so, when work is pirated, it's not just the author who's losing work. It's the editors, it's the publicists, it's all the people the author really enjoys working with. And it's the bookstores. And so eventually if there isn't a monetary incentive, all of those things are going to go away. So if you love to read, or if you want to be a writer, you can't be supporting piracy. That's a big ask. I totally understand. That's a lot of money for a book. But even if you buy it as a used book, that's better than piracy.
Yeah. Well, Chad Lutzke says, you seem to find an artistic beauty in even the most disturbing stories, such as Cheryl Strayed's The Molesting Grandfather and the Baby Bird. Is there anything you've read that was disturbing enough to where you felt it had no redeemable quality? And if so, what draws the line for you?
Oh, one thing, a story that I had really loved going into was a kind of landmark story that had been part of a collection written by the writer David Foster Wallace. David killed himself 11 years ago this summer, almost to the date. And until then, David really was the golden boy. He had written a huge novel called Infinite Jest, but one of his first books was a collection of short stories called The Girl with Curious Hair. And in the title story, there's a kind of group of punks. And toward the end of the story, they take a puppy, just a very small puppy, and they take it into a basement and they dump it with lighter fluid and they set it on fire and they laugh as it runs around screaming and dies. And it took me a long time to get over that story. And I never really went back to David Foster Wallace's work with much enthusiasm after that story. And my editor always said, "You will never write a story like this. You will never write a story where, especially a puppy, is tortured to death while people laugh." And I said, "No, I will never write that story."
Yeah. I don't think there's anything we need to add to that. I think we can. I think
it does really shut things down.
I think we can move on to the next question. We don't need to go into any further detail.
Did I just take a turd? Did I just drop a turd in the podcast? I think I did.
Well, we've done it at past the hour mark. I feel if you're in for past the hour, you're in for anything, even if it involves torturing and laughing at puppies. But we're gonna swiftly move on to a question from Timothy Fox, and he says, "Your fiction seems at times to suggest that humanity is responsible for its own problems, and the root of these problems is a willful refusal to learn. How far off is this observation?"
Wow, I'm not sure if it's a willful refusal to learn. I'm not sure. I'm going to be public school educated right now. And I thought it was, I can't remember if it's Aristotelian or Socratic, where you present a story in which the protagonist doesn't learn. The protagonist makes constant mistakes. Scarlett O'Hara never realizes. She never gets smart. The first line in Gone with the Wind is her saying, "There's not going to be any war." And from that moment, you are so on board because you feel smarter than Scarlett. And right through the end of the book, she never hooks up with Rhett. She never really falls in love with the one guy she should fall in love with. And so you learn, you get smart, you learn the lesson, but Scarlett never does. So in this, whether it's Aristotelian or Socratic form, the idea is to show a character that does not achieve enlightenment, but by doing so, sort of coach the reader, coach the audience to the enlightenment.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I think it's something that we see in the best fiction and the best storytelling. And I think it's something that writers would be wise to ponder when writing their own fiction.
And it's also really important, sort of intrinsic in horror, because horror, you don't necessarily want a happy ending, but you do want a kind of cautionary tale ending.
Yeah.
Rosemary does not abort that baby. She ultimately has the devil's baby. And then she goes on to care for it. In The Sentinel, the beautiful model goes on to be the Sentinel. That horror always has a kind of downer ending, but it leaves the audience enlightened.
Yeah. And you want something that the audience is going to ponder and to reflect upon after. You need that for it to be an effective and an enduring story.
Right. You need Amy Irving to be screaming with Sissy Spacek's bloody hand around her wrist.
Right.
You need the family in Poltergeist to drive away as their house crumbles into the ground. You really need the dark ending, because happy endings just don't work in horror.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a famous quote that every story is a tragedy if you go far enough.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Lucas Milliron says, your style and voice is so unique and genre-bending. Has that helped or hindered your early success, or was it difficult pitching when publishers prefer more traditional, easy-to-market genre fiction? I guess we have touched on that quite a bit.
I was told early on that you should write a book that can be defined by the success of previous books. So when I was writing Fight Club, I was told that the market is looking for a Chicano Joy Luck Club, because Joy Luck Club was a huge, huge success. And they were just looking for a different ethnicity for the Joy Luck Club. So the market will always be looking for something that can be spun as a known success. I cannot tell you how many books have been presented to me as the female version of Fight Club. And they've all kind of disappeared, more or less. They never really achieved a readership or built an audience. But so many people are trying to break the equation of creating a female Fight Club. That's another example of trying to create a future success based on an existing model, which, kind of works, but it doesn't really create a classic. Classic's kind of got to be its own thing.
Yeah. I think the problem, particularly if you write for market or you write because you're trying to piggyback off the success of another book or another film, the problem is that it's an ever-changing book and movie environment. So if you try to write what's on trend or what has worked or what has lit up the zeitgeist in that moment, well, by the time you finished it, it might be out of favor.
And you're going to be one of 10,000 people trying to ride that same wave.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. For me, that doesn't really work. I think it's authenticity and originality that is a safer recipe. I mean, I guess that there's no guarantee of commercial success, but is there ever guarantee of that? And is that even what you want to strive for? Write a good story, have that as the starting point.
Exactly. And also express something that you see resonates really strongly when you discuss it with other people, like children of the porn.
Yes.
You will be talking about children of the porn. That will define that experience for the rest of your life, because it's clever and it's universal.
Yeah.
And so that's what you're looking for, is something with a huge resonance that's not already been introduced or recognized in the culture.
Yeah. I'm trying to think how you can put that out, because I feel it needs to be out in the world, but as we've said, it's going to ban itself. I wonder if it would work as some sort of podcast series if you had it as an audio play. But I feel even then you're probably going to have to blank out the O. I don't know if you can just write children and porn in fucking anything. I'm not sure it's possible.
Oh, but if nothing else, next time you go to a party, introduce the topic of the big box of porn in the woods. And almost everyone will have a story of finding a bag, a box, a duffel bag, a suitcase. It's all these different manifestations of the same thing.
Yeah.
And it really changed them because they found it at a point in their childhood when they were not ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
A friend of mine, Chelsea Kane, who writes thrillers, when she was 8, she found a huge box of porn in Key West. And she was so excited. She just thought it was free magazines. So she roped it to the back of her bike And she biked home several miles with this very heavy box, presented it with such pride and enthusiasm to her family. She said, "Look, I found us free, beautiful magazines." And it was all hardcore, really raunchy porn. And her parents went crazy and they totally shamed her. And they said, "You are going to take this back to where you found it, this filthy, filthy material, and you're going to leave it where you found it. And shame on you. And you do that right now." So she had to bike this heavy thing that's suddenly a huge albatross. She had to take it all the way back and leave it. And she's never really recovered from that either.
Yeah. Man, I hate it with those stories when the parent's approach is to shame the child, because at that point, as a parent or as an adult with a child presenting that to you, you have two paths that you can take. You can either, look at a way to not really acknowledge it for what it is and to shy away from the adult nature of it, or you can go hard on that child. But I don't see the value of shaming an 8-year-old for an act that it's not bad because they had no knowledge that it was bad. So it seems absurd.
Well, and that kind of riffs on the fantastic story that a woman told me once. And forgive me, I've told this story before. I had read Guts. And she told me that when she was a small girl, when she was 7 years old in second grade, she'd been a brownie, which is a precursor to Girl Scouts. And she also had a stomach ache, and her mother made her lay on a vibrating heating pad. This woman is about my age, so this would have been in the 1960s. And she said as a 7-year-old, she woke up and this heating pad had slid down between her legs. And she had the most fantastic feeling, something she had never felt before. So she invited all the brownies over. She had them all ride this heating pad. And so she said it was like Sex in the City for 7-year-old girls. And they all just loved this heating pad until the day that her mother came home from work early and sent the little girls home and then just beat this girl, this woman who was talking to me, just beat her with a cord of this heating pad. And said, "You slut, you dirty whore, what kind of piece of shit am I raising?" And sometimes you can't save that. You can't go back and say it should not have been that way. But you can provide an opportunity for people to tell their story, whether it's Chelsea or it's Cheryl Strayed, to talk about what happened so that they can really fully remember it. And they can exhaust their emotional attachment to it. That is the best gift you can give them, is to recognize the thing and to allow people to talk about the thing that no one talks about. Because that's the only way people are going to move beyond that thing that should not have happened.
And that is the note that we're going to go out on, because we're all out of time now. You've got to go. You've got a class to teach, but I think it's a powerful point. And yeah, thank you so much, Chuck, for spending all this time with me. This has been fun. There's so much that we've spoken about, and there's so much more that I would like to get into at some point. So if you ever want to come back on This Is Horror, then the invitation is there.
Yeah, yes, please. Let's do it for the paperback, if not sooner, okay?
Okay, let's do it. Thank you again. Have a great rest of the day.
Okay, Tyler Jones, Criterium. Just one more plug. All right? Thank you.
Wow, what an honor and a privilege to chat with Chuck Palahniuk. And I can't wait for him to come back on the show. There's so much more that I want to get into. We barely spoke about Lullaby, and I think there's a fascinating story both on and off the page there to be discussed. And we really did only scratch the surface on a number of topics. And I know that Bob Pastorella wants to chat with Chuck as well. It was incredibly unfortunate, the timing of the hurricane and the power being out. But hey, next time it'll be both me and Bob with Chuck. And talking of next time, we will be chatting with Daniel Kraus, who co-authored The Living Dead with George A. Romero. So if you're a fan of the Night of the Living Dead franchise, and I would imagine most of you are, then that is a book and that is an episode that you're not going to want to miss. And that is the next This Is Horror podcast conversation. And right around the corner, we've got a conversation with David Cummings, the founder of the No Sleep podcast. And again, absolutely fascinating. So if you're a fan of that audio drama, then stay tuned, because I think it might be the most in-depth interview that David has given. Now, I know that there are going to be new listeners as a result of this conversation with Chuck, and I would encourage you all to check out the archives. We've got 365 episodes. I mean, the clue is in the title, TIH 365. But either go on your favorite podcast app and just search for various horror writers that you're interested in hearing from, or go to the website, thisishorror.co.uk, and just start typing them in on the search bar at the top of the website. Conversations you might be particularly interested in include our conversation with Joe R. Lansdale, the legendary crime writer and famous for the likes of the Hap and Leonard series and Bubba Hotep. We've also got conversations with Josh Malerman, the author of Bird Box, and if you haven't read the book, I'm sure that you've seen the film on Netflix. We also spoke to Anthony Johnston, most famous for the likes of Dead Space and Atomic Blonde. And then if you're a True Blood fan, there was Charlene Harris. So if you want to delve a little bit deeper into the Sookie Stackhouse series, then you got to check that one out too. But perhaps for Chuck Palahniuk fans, it may be the conversations with Craig Davidson that most appeal to you. So we spoke about his work as Nick Cutter. We spoke about what to do when you have creative burnout. Spoke about how to write supernatural and human villains. And that is just an all-round fascinating conversation. Now, if you enjoyed the show and you're thinking, oh, I'd like to support those guys, I'd like to get early bird access to every single episode, I'd like to submit questions to future guests, well, guess what, my friend? You are in luck, because you can become a patron at patreon.com/thisishorror. There are many different levels to support us at, so check them out and see which is a good fit for you, and you will be a part of the horror family. Okay, before I wrap up, let us have a quick word from our sponsors.
From best-selling horror author Lee Mountford comes the Supernatural Horror Collection. 3 hugely popular novels in one box set. The Demonic, The Mark, and Forest of the Damned, together in one terrifying volume. Available in ebook and paperback, and a high-quality audiobook that is sure to get under your skin. Haunted houses, haunted forests, haunted people. Search Amazon and Audible now for the Supernatural Horror Collection. Don't just read horror, experience it.
You like The Twilight Zone? What about Tales from the Crypt? Or perhaps Black Mirror? Well, we got you covered. The Other Stories is a weekly short story podcast. We've got sci-fi, horror, thriller, and weird stories delivered right to your podcast feed every Monday morning. So find us on your favourite podcast app or go to acast.com/The Other Stories. And remember, these aren't the stories your mother used to tell you. These are the other stories.
As always, I would like to end with a quote. And this is from Chelsea Kane. I've always been more interested in what happens after the bad thing has happened. The fallout of the bad thing. When people are already damaged. I'm less interested in seeing people when they're fine and following their journey to becoming damaged. I'll see you in the next episode with Daniel Kraus when we'll be chatting about all things George A. Romero. But until then, take care of yourselves, be good to one another, read horror, keep on writing, and have a great, great day.
This is Horror Podcast.